Greetings, y'all, and welcome to week 6, our final week together in our YA course. It's been such a joy working with all of you, and I'm really excited to read your final papers or your final lesson plans, whatever you choose to do for this final project. So thank you so much for your level of engagement. This past week with Legendborn was no exception, and it was really interesting to see just how absolutely polarizing Tracy Deonn's writing was for y'all. It was interesting because some of you said this was my absolute favorite book of the semester, and others said this was my least favorite book of the semester, and there were very few sort of in-between folks with regard to this text, and so it was just fascinating to see how it shook out. And as always, I just really appreciated your honesty. So let's jump into the reviews here. So the first one is with Andromeda. Andromeda says, I've had a hard time getting into this one. I've read a few fantasy novels. My favorite series is I Am Number 4. But this book just didn't reel me in like most books. Once I did get into it more, I found some things I really liked and thought were unique. And so, again, it was one of those texts that I think just by holding it, because of its sheer length, perhaps was a bit overwhelming, I think, for some. A lot of folks said just the length of the text, it just sort of went on and on and on unnecessarily, and that was something that was, something that pushed you away from this particular text. And I think that's fine. I think that's a good thing that you are able to be distinguishing. And a lot of you were thoughtful in saying it's not just that it was too long, it's that I don't know that there's a lot of young adults who would find this text interesting. So I think that's very, very interesting as well. The next comment comes from Ben. Ben says, I was overwhelmed by its size, again, similar to what was said by Andromeda, but also by the fast-paced world building and info dumps that seemed unending. It turns out, looking back, I think I was just out of step with the story. As I continued, I synced up with the rhythm of the piece, and the rest was a joy to devour. I began to feel so close to this work that it was a sort of nostalgic feeling that took me back to YA fantasy novels from my early days of cracking books. It was reminiscent of Brandon Sanderson's Mistborn series and Stephanie Meyer's Twilight on a surface level. And so again, this I think was a really nice comment by Ben, who was saying that, yes, it was difficult to get into this text originally, but once I really cracked it open, and I like this notion of getting in rhythm with a text, I think that's a really important note. It had that nostalgia, and Ben was not the only person who mentioned the nostalgia. Obviously, Andromeda mentioned her comparisons to texts that were familiar to her with I Am Number 4, and Ben talked about both Mistborn and Twilight, and others really made some really striking comparisons, I think, between Legendborn and their favorite fantasy novels. And so there is something resonant, right, about this text, because it does have some of those very comforting, familiar feels for those of you who are into fantasy novels, but it's also disruptive in a purposeful way to say it's not like all other novels that you may be familiar with. And so that, I think, was a really important observation, both by Andromeda and Ben, but others made that comparison to say it reminded me of this text, and perhaps that was the thing that kept people going. Whereas I also agree with Ben's notion that the world-building element and the amount of information and the amount of characters, as I warned you in our video last week, made it so that you almost had to keep notes. And Andromeda, I think, later on mentioned she had to keep copious notes of the characters and their lineage and their connections to one another. Chris, I thought, made a really nice comparison, and this comment resonated with me because I went to college in North Carolina to a different UNC school, and I also taught in North Carolina. So Chris says, another thing that makes the story so good is Deonn's attention to detail. UNC Chapel Hill is my dad's alma mater, as well as Deonn's, and having spent a good bit of time on the campus, her storytelling brings it to life in your head. She gives some of the best descriptions of a place I have read before, and I think it is because she is pretty casual about it. She never spent multiple paragraphs to depict a building or anything, and it feels so much more genuine to me. And so anybody who's actually been to North Carolina or lived in the South knows that even her description of Bo-Berry biscuits from Bojangles, that's a very North Carolina thing. And so she was being descriptive, and she was being genuine and authentic to place. And that matters as well, because she built this fantasy world that was also grounded in reality. And so that attention to detail that Chris notes here, I think, is really valuable as well. And having been to UNC Chapel Hill, it seems as though he was able to make that comparison and realize that Dion's depiction of Chapel Hill, and I think it's a very honest portrayal as well, was accurate. And that adds to sort of this almost nonfiction feel of a fantasy novel, a very strange combination of those two genres. The final comment here comes from Spencer. Spencer says, classic themes of racism and oppression had run their course in this book, but not in the general sense. Nowhere else in the book was there another black character besides the waiting staff at the gala. This shows us how racism really is and how it affects the characters as they are real people. And so this notion of race, and a lot of you had mentioned race and oppression, and some of you had also mentioned that connection. It was lovely to read when people made that connection between windows and mirrors as something that was authentic to this text. And so whereas there was some fantasy world building involved, it was meant to be also an honest portrayal of the difficulties and challenges that our nation is feeling and facing at this particular moment. So I think Spencer really touched on this in a nice way to say, it is authentic, it is real, similar to what Chris said, and it's capturing this particular, crystallized moment in time where we are dealing with a lot of racial strife and social justice issues in America. And so I think that what Tracy Dion was trying to do was to reimagine this world and to say, what if we realized just the legacy of brilliance and greatness and disrupting this idea of King Arthur's lineage as also an affair with a slave. What if we are to realize that as a reality of this new portrayal of this legend? So I think this was a powerful way of saying, yes, it's challenging, and perhaps some of you had mentioned it was too heavy-handed with these issues of race, but I think that Tracy Dion was trying to do some social justice work while also operating within this fantasy genre, which is a tricky thing to do. And so this discussion of race brings us into what Ebony Elizabeth Thomas talked about in her introduction to the Dark Fantastic. And what she mentions here from the very beginning is that the Dark Fantastic is something that is trying to strike against a particular genre of fantasy that is suffering from what she refers to as an imagination gap. And she says this in her text. I have described the diversity crisis in children's and young adult media as an imagination gap. She goes on to say, this imagination gap is caused in part by the lack of diversity in childhood and teen life depicted in books, television, and films. When youth grow up without seeing diverse images in the mirrors, windows, and doors of children's and young adult literature, they are confined to single stories about the world around them, and ultimately, the development of their imaginations is affected. And so, this quote obviously is pretty powerful because it brings back that concept that we heard about from Grace Lynn of windows and mirrors and sliding glass doors, and the fact that a lot of these stories that are considered canonical, classical, young adult literature texts usually put people of color in secondary or minor roles, right? And so that's a lack of imagination. To imagine that a person of color could be an authentic protagonist in some of these fantasy novels is really quite amazing when we think about it. When we think about the text that we've read as our own children, when we were children ourselves, and the books that have been sort of blessed as part of our canon, to imagine that most of those texts have young white protagonists and really push people of color to the side is a lack of imagination. I mean, it's really not much more than that if it's not also then something that's done quite purposefully, because a lot of times people need to be able to speak from that experience. And so the encouragement and the promotion of Black authorship and own voices texts are really quite important to tearing down this imagination gap, I think. This next quote really goes into greater depth, I think, these series of quotes, as to what is meant by the dark fantastic. And so Ebony Elizabeth Thomas says the following: "The fantastic captures the wonder of stepping into a world that never was and immersing yourself in it in a way that speculative fiction does not." So she does a really nice job in the text to delineate between speculative fiction, and then she also delineates between Afrofuturism as well as the Black Fantastic. Remember, hers is called the Dark Fantastic. And she says that speculative fiction still in many ways is dominated by white authors writing about white characters. And so she delineates that between the speculative fiction, okay, and then the Black Fantastic. The Black Fantastic, she says, is this: "The Black Fantastic has historically been liberating, activist, artistic production in the face of erasure and marginalization." And she goes on to list authors such as Octavia Butler, for example. And that is a text that tries to rewrite the world, right? Either the current situation or the future, as a way of trying to reimagine what life would look like if Black stories were told from Black perspectives, as well as sort of that notion of counter storytelling, which we saw in Tracy Deonn. She differentiates then Black Fantastic from Afrofuturism by saying the following: "Afrofuturism is both an aesthetic and an activist movement in the arts." She doesn't go into tremendous detail here, but and I'm perhaps dating myself, but if anybody knows the work of George Clinton in Parliament of Funkadelic or Africa Bambaataa, you'll see characters who are, they're kind of characters, but musicians, for example, artists, who are doing very futuristic things, dressing in a particular way as a way of telling the future rather than telling the past or the current moment. And so it's more of an artistic expression of power and Black lives, by also recreating almost the future, if you can imagine what that would look like. And so then she gets a little bit more pointed, Ebony Elizabeth Thomas does, by talking about the Dark Fantastic in this way. The Dark Fantastic shifts focus away from white heroic protagonists, and illuminating the imaginary stories of people of color at the margins can reveal much, especially for today's youth. And so again, it's that moving away from just the white heroic protagonist, and it's trying to figure out where fantasy and telling those stories from Black perspectives and Black characters can add a lot of value, not just from a canonical standpoint, but by being disruptive to those traditional stories, I think in a lot of ways, in the same sense that Tracy Deonn does with Legendborn. And so she says, going on this last quote, "The Dark Fantastic is my term for the role that racial difference plays in our fantastically storied imaginations. The fantastic includes fantasy fiction, but goes beyond it to include all stories about worlds that never were, whether they are marketed, shelved, or classified as fairy tales, horror, superhero comics, soft science fiction, alternate histories, or otherwise. I prefer the fantastic as a concept and a term to the more common designation of speculative fiction." And so she's just making very pointed choices. And I want you to note that because, and thinking about your final papers as well, notice how she gives a definition, a term that she's working with, the Black Fantastic, or the Dark Fantastic, differentiates it between the Black Fantastic, differentiates it between Afrofuturism, says I don't like speculative fiction for a particular reason, and instead I'm using this terminology and it does this type of work. And so she lists those things and those areas and those genres of text that could be considered under the umbrella of Dark Fantastic. And so when you're creating your keywords paper, for those of you who are doing that, I want you to think long and hard about how are you going to operationalize or say this is how my idea or my concept or my keyword can be defined and then viewed in young adult literature. So a lot of comments about that in your in those comments that I provided from the discussion board last week. So make sure you're thinking about that. How are you going to define it? Because obviously we see that Ebony Elizabeth Thomas does a really smart job of defining and saying, this is my keyword, and this is how I'm differentiating it from other keywords or other similar words, okay? And so with that being said, I want to jump into our discussions of what's going to be due for the following week. So right now you're watching my announcement. You are going to read the keyword graphic novel by Hatfield. Again, that's in the course readings. Make sure you're reading that. I would suggest reading it before you actually pick up the graphic novel of Nimona by Noelle Stevenson. And then I'm also asking that you listen to the audiobook. If you don't want to purchase the audiobook and you are a member of the Bozeman Library system, the city system, you can actually go into, there's a website called Hoopla, on the website for the Bozeman Library, and you can get the audiobook for free. And the reason why I wanted you to listen to both the audiobook and read the graphic novel is because, first of all, it's a wonderful audiobook. It tells the story through a cast, not just a singular author, not just a singular reader of the text. And so it's actually quite an amazing audiobook. But it's an interesting move from graphic novel to just audio. What are the limitations of moving a graphic novel into just an audio, I think is a pretty interesting thing. And so I'd love to hear your comments of that in the discussion board. It's important to note that you do not have any responses that are needed on the discussion board this week. You do need to do your picture book talk. If you've not done so already, post that to Flipgrid. But otherwise, I'm trying to give you as much space as you can. Again, the audiobook is only I want to say 2 or 3 hours long, so it's a very quick read. And the graphic novel shouldn't take you as long, certainly not as long as Legendborn. So hopefully you have those out of the way, your discussion out of the way pretty quickly, so you can be wrapping things up with your final project, whether it's your lesson plans or your keywords paper, and that's due Friday at 11:59 p.m. So make sure you are working towards all of that. Before we wrap things up for today, as I mentioned, you are going to be reading and listening to Nimona. And if you want to read and listen at the same time, that could be an interesting experience as well. The reason why, beyond just being a really good audiobook, it's worth noting that it won the 2017 American Library Association Award for Best Audiobook. And so I just think that it's an excellent example, and we can also have a debate whether or not listening to an audiobook is the same thing as reading a book. Specifically, is it the same thing as reading a graphic novel? Just a little bit about Nimona. It is the story of this is a hard one to explain, about a young, shape-shifting girl, perhaps girl, I'm putting girl in quotation marks, who wants to become the sidekick and work for and I'm going to put this again in air quotes, sorry for the air quotes, a villain named Ballister Blackheart, who is working against the institution, as it is called. So it's essentially a government institution, and his arch nemesis, or his enemy, is Ambrosius Goldenloin. And so a lot of things are going on here. It is a really fascinating story about villainry, about good versus evil, and the difficult distinction between the two. And if I'm being honest with you, I just finished re-listening to it this weekend, and it leaves me sad. And I don't know if that's something unique to me. I think that the themes and the character of Nimona and the struggle that she faces, if you could read it just as an interesting graphic novel, fantasy graphic novel. As a parent and as someone who was a teacher who worked with young adults, it left me feeling sad for lost childhoods. It left me feeling depressed. I cried. And I don't know, maybe I'm just misreading or overreading things. Some of you may be like, it was a fine book, whatever. I just always end up feeling sad after I finish this book. And so I'm sorry if it leaves you feeling that particular way. But I do want to make sure that we have this really neat opportunity to read and listen to audiobooks, which is why we're ending the semester this way. I also thought it was going to be sort of a lighter text as far as the amount that you have to read, so it would free up some time and space for you to work on your papers. So I'm interested to see what you think about it. I'm going to share with you here. Oh, and it's worth noting that this particular text started, and we read a little bit about transmedia and participatory culture in the Thomas piece this past week. This book started as a web series, as Noelle Stevenson as a cartoonist writing stuff, and fans really picked it up, and fandom really pushed it into this really important graphic novel popular space. And so once it became a very popular web series, that's when it got published. And once it got published, that's when it became this audiobook, and this very popular, award-winning audiobook. So it's a very interesting move, and we see how fandom impacts the way texts get picked up within the within popular culture as well. And so I'm interested to see what you think about this text in general. It's hard to do a book talk about this in particular, but I will tell you that it has a couple keywords that I'm sharing here with you. Fantasy, identity comes up really big here. The monstrous, if you want to do a more feminist reading of this, I would say hysterics is perhaps a different kind of keyword that feminists might read as the monstrous, and how, in particular, Nimona is being portrayed. Mental health, I think, comes into this as well. Trauma, orphan, the loss of parents, comes in again as another theme, similar to Legendborn, I think, as well. Coming of age, kind of, when you realize the complexities of Nimona. Good versus evil, as I mentioned, and the difficult distinction between the two, who's good, who's evil. And even as I was rereading this, things about biological warfare, you'll see illness and pandemics, I think, sort of come into play here. So you read this text a little bit differently. I first read it, I think, back in 2017 or 2016. You read it a little bit differently now under these current circumstances. So like I said, it's difficult to do a book talk about this, but I will mention here that we have just a couple of cells that I will share with you, and that I think sort of get at the specific challenges of this text and trying to nail down who Nimona is. And it starts, the character on the top left is Ballister Blackheart, and Nimona has purple hair here. Ballister says, "Nimona, I know something happened to you, something you're not telling me. I trust you know, and you can trust me. You know that, right? Boss, it's fine, okay? Just let it go. Are you hungry? I thought maybe we could order a pizza." Sure. "Any particular toppings you want?" "Nah, you pick." "Sardines it is then. Don't you dare put sardines on that pizza." And so this, I think, these couple of cells actually touch on the relationship between Ballister and Nimona in a really interesting way. The dynamics between them, you'll see that Nimona has a sordid past that she's a little bit less willing to talk about, and this adult and child relationship as almost like a foster parent, as almost a teacher-student. You'll have to determine what the relationship is itself, but I trust you'll get there. So with that being said, this is, I think, my final video for the semester. I want to thank y'all so much for your engagement. It's been wonderful, at least talking to this camera and talking to you. Y'all have wonderful reading. I'm looking forward to reading your papers. Take care.